Hi. So, my article talked a lot about rhetoric, what rhetoric is, and situates that in a historical and social kind of context for that period of time. And then it also tries to kind of make us understand better the difference between what really was Baroque music and what really was Romantic music. So first off, you're going to see that we have a quote from a fortune cookie. The object of rhetoric is not truth, but persuasion. So that's very true. You don't have to be actually right to have rhetoric. You just have to be able to convince somebody what you want to do. And that's what rhetoric is. It's very calculated, as you see in the definition that we have there. So eloquence, then, is a measure of how effective someone is at producing in their audience that response that they're trying to get at. And the authors go into a little bit of a story about how they saw a really eloquent performance of somebody playing a Bach sonata. So what made it eloquent was how well they were able to evoke the passions in the listeners. It wasn't necessarily that they played all the right notes, it was that they were able to transmit some kind of pathos from themselves into the audience. So if you take a look at this quote by Francois de Fenelon, he's one of the nephews of Louis XVI, he says that basically a discourse is trying to rouse a person to experience the passions, and if they did that, then they're eloquent. So let's talk a little bit about why there's a weird font that's happening inside of this paragraph, and that's because those things that are in a weird font are so because they're a little bit more than the word themselves mean. So passions are really more profound than regular emotions. They are heightened. They are the archetypal form of that particular emotion. So they're a little bit harder to get at. Think about the humors that people talked about in pre-Enlightenment science, basically, that said that those were the pure states, and because you have fluid in your body that is telling you to be something, that you are that something all the way to the max. So, and if you achieve that, then you're eloquent. And that's not necessarily just eloquent, offhand compliment, oh, that was a very eloquent speech that you just made. They really did a good job of rousing a person to experience a passion. So that's what you have to do to achieve eloquent status. It's like expert on Guitar Hero, but better. So, next thing that you have on your handout is the 5 offices of rhetoric. And this is just kind of a structural tool that people would use to be able to write their rhetorical speeches. So all of those things were taken by a creator. In the case of music, that's going to be the composer. And through the performer, that is transmitted to the audience. So you next see this paragraph that kind of explains what rhetorical capital R music is. And that is the time period that we're talking about, basically, that encompasses pre-Baroque, Baroque, and then ends with the dawn of Romanticism. And you can read that on your own. I want to get to this timeline that you see here at the very bottom of your sheet. And you'll notice that, again, we have the fancy font. I want you to think of this as a very fancy and enlightened, higher order kind of thing, because that's what the authors try to situate it as. It's an indubitably variable timeline of cultural context, just the same as passions and eloquence are kind of higher order ideals. So the first person that you see on the timeline, this is Claudio Monteverdi, and he was the person that decided that text supersedes music in all cases. So he was the person that started the movement of vocal music, basically, that carried through the Baroque era and then kind of started ending as instrumentalists were taking over into the Romantic period. And he was a prolific composer, as I'm sure we all know. Next person on the docket is Mr. John Locke. He was one of the founders of the Enlightenment, and it was kind of these Enlightenment ideas that, being sown in the past, were able to kind of come into people's collective consciousness later on, and that's kind of how the Romantic movement got started, was because of the ideas that he was talking about in his writings and speeches too, because he was an orator as well. Next thing you see is a picture of an orator. It's actually interesting that it wasn't until this period in time, around 1500 to 1800, that music was seen as being closer to rhetoric than it was to the sciences. Music before this period was a science. That's what they thought of it as. So it makes sense that they were trying to get at the humors and arouse the passions. But now they know that it's closer to using speech to move a person instead of it just is a physiological thing that happens. The next person you see is Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was kind of the progenitor of the French Revolution. And it wasn't necessarily that the French Revolution is, the ideal thing to think about in the move to Romantic thought, but it was kind of a coalescence of a bunch of different cultural and sociological methods of thought that people were having. So it's a pretty good example, at least in the author's opinion, it's a pretty good example of what they were trying to get at. So you can think of that as kind of the first beginnings of Baroque period thought breaking down. And then the last person you see is our good buddy Ludwig van Beethoven, and he was the quintessential Romantic composer. At this point, music is absolute. People are starting to think about formal analysis, and music has become autonomous. It's not necessarily subservient to a text, and it's not used for religious services anymore. Music is coming from this inner consciousness, and it's trying to get at the idea of the sublime. So, think too in the difference between Baroque music and Romantic music, how people thought about the audience. If rhetoric is about convincing somebody something, then you're having your audience in mind. You're trying to get them to do something. Romantic, not such a thing. The author even goes as far as to quote the romantic aloofness thing. People didn't really care whether or not they roused their audiences. It was more about music for the sake of music. So that's what Burgess and Haynes were talking about in their book, and Amy will tell you a little bit more about what happens later on.